Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them. Artists, scientists, educators, social scientists, government leaders, politicians, each are one to one. By the year 2050, 32 million Americans will be 85 or older, and 16 million baby boomers will have Alzheimer's disease. Closer to home, 1 in 5 of us will either have the disease or will be taking care of someone who does. It's a subject that instills fear in so many of us, but it's one that must be confronted. And joining us to gently help us do that is Lou-Ellen Barkan, the CEO and president of the Alzheimer's Association's New York City chapter. Welcome.
Thank you.
You know, I think all of us know a little something about Alzheimer's disease, but why don't you define the disease for us and how it's different from other diseases that have dementia as a component?
Well, let's start with the idea that dementia is actually the larger category of physical illnesses that affect the brain. And dementia can be a consequence of another illness like Parkinson's disease. Sometimes people have small strokes, and the effect is dementia. And those are physical illnesses, as is Alzheimer's disease. One of the very difficult fantasies about Alzheimer's disease is that it is a mental illness. In no way is Alzheimer's a mental illness. It's a physical illness. It's a progressive physical illness of the brain. And unfortunately, today, we don't know what causes it. We don't know how to cure it, how to prevent it. We're working on that as we speak.
But it's characterized by a buildup of plaque in the brain, different areas of the brain. Is that correct?
Well, we're not sure. Some scientists think that's correct. Last year we did a program called Competing Paradigms in Alzheimer's Research, and we brought a number of scientists together. And each one of them has a very different idea. Some believe it's plaque that builds up in the brain. Some believe it's tangles, which is sort of an outcome of the plaque that prevents the neurons from connecting. We don't know. What we do know is that most of the organizations in this country that are interested in medicine, whether they're biotechs, large pharmaceuticals, individual labs, are working on this problem because this will be the largest health epidemic this country has ever known.
And is the disease higher in men or women or in any racial or ethnic groups compared to others?
There are theories that the disease is higher in communities of color. Again, we don't know why. So obviously, people talk about diet, but some of the studies that are done around diet are very difficult, and the science coming out of that is really unclear. So I wish I had more information, better factual information for you and for everybody. But there's a lot we don't know. But what we do know is a lot of people are interested in this, and that the economic outcome for the person or the company that finds this cure
is going to be huge.
Going to be huge. And so the economic incentive for folks to work on it is very powerful.
So they are working on it. Does that mean a lot of people are working on it?
Yes, a lot of companies, a lot of individuals are working on it, and we're grateful for that.
Now, there is a test that can confirm that you have Alzheimer's, or?
There are a series of tests that are a combination of cognitive and physical tests that include things that have to do with looking at the brain, with imaging. It has to do with cognitive testing, which takes something like 4 or 5 hours, and I've been through some of this myself, so I know, to see whether someone has Alzheimer's disease. At the end of that, doctors today can give someone a diagnosis that's probably about 99% accurate, and we're grateful for that. That was not true 10, 15 years ago.
So tell me about the Alzheimer's Association and what you do.
Our job is to protect and help not only the people who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and other related forms of dementia, but also to help family caregivers and professional caregivers provide the best possible care and take care of themselves.
Now, there seems to be a lot more talk about Alzheimer's disease. Hollywood has even gotten in on the act with the movies The Savages and Away from Her. What did you think of how they handled the issue?
We are very grateful to the popular media for the work they've done, particularly this year with the movies that you just described. Away from Her and The Savages were great examples. The Savages, if you've seen it, is about caregiving, and caregiving is a very important part of our work. We care deeply about the person that cares for the person with the disease. Very often, if someone is well into their 80s when they have Alzheimer's, the caregiver is also someone who's well into their 80s, and we're taking care of two people at once. The movies demonstrate, in that case, a young couple, a brother and sister, taking care of their father at the point in time when he has dementia until he dies. And it's a pretty accurate depiction of what we hear about at the chapter. The movie Away From Her is also an interesting story. If you've seen it, it's about a woman who goes to self-selects the opportunity to go into a nursing home and then progresses pretty quickly into the later stages of the disease, also about her husband and the effect of the disease on him. That's a little more dramatic in impact, but what these movies and others like it have done for us is they've heightened public awareness dramatically, and we're very appreciative. That's part of our job, is to get the story out. And every time there's a story, a movie, a magazine article, or a prominent person who discloses, very helpful to us.
And one of those prominent people has been former Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, whose husband has Alzheimer's, and they were talking about the phenomenon of his being in the nursing home and falling in love with, forgetting who she was and falling in love with another woman.
That story is so similar to the movie Away From Her, which is a very interesting story. The tragedy of Sandra Day O'Connor's experience, in addition, is that she actually left her job, as I'm sure you know, as a Supreme Court Justice to take care of her husband. And then the progression of the disease went so quickly, and when he was admitted to the nursing home, and left her really sort of sitting home wondering what to do.
Right.
The impact on caregivers is really extraordinary. Very often people are forced, as she was, to give up their work, stay home and take care of people, not knowing what they're going to do with their own lives.
Right.
Very, very difficult.
Was the association involved in either of the movies in any way?
No, we're not involved with the movies. We sometimes do get called, both at the national level, our national association is in Chicago, and locally, to talk with people. But typically we do it at the end when the producers want to have some sort of opening, then they invite us to join.
Right, right. So you have to go to free movies.
We do occasionally. Right.
You have a very personal experience with Alzheimer's disease. Did your family history with the disease influence your decision to work for the association?
Absolutely. I had actually come out of retirement to take this job because my father had dementia. In the days when my dad was sick, the word Alzheimer's disease was not as accurately diagnosed, so I'm not sure to this day exactly what he had, but we think it was Alzheimer's disease. He had a 12-year history, a progression of 12 years. My mom was the caregiver. They used up their personal resources taking care of him. We kept him at home, with care at home, very expensive, very time-consuming to find the right people. It was a very difficult time for our family. And then, very coincidentally, my daughter married a young man whose father died at the age of 54 of what we call the early onset form of the disease. Just as an aside, 10% of the people with Alzheimer's disease in this country are under the age of 60. And that's a statistic that many people don't know. So that is, for some people in that category, have a form of the disease. It's very rare, but does exist, which is really a genetic form of the disease. With these two stories in mind, when I received a call that this particular opportunity was available, I thought it would be a great opportunity for me to use the skills I had from other jobs and really make a difference.
There is no cure for Alzheimer's. So how does one treat someone who has it? And what are some of the techniques for managing it and providing the person with a better quality of life?
Well, first of all, let's talk about early diagnosis, because very often people hide from their families if they think they have a problem, and they don't get an assessment early enough. And by the time the disease is moved to another stage, things are moving pretty far and pretty fast, and that's not a good outcome. We'd like people to say, gee, I'm having a little trouble with my memory or other symptoms that we can talk about, and then step up rather quickly and get an accurate assessment so we know what we're dealing with. Some forms of dementia are not actually Alzheimer's disease. And so again, we want to be sure people are diagnosed correctly. The next step is to make sure that all of the resources are in place, and getting to somebody before they move into the middle stage allows the individual with the disease to have some say in their future. What sort of care do they want? Do they want to be at home? Is it easier on their family and on themselves if they're away? What's the family story? Is the spouse working? Is there a spouse? Sometimes it's just the children. So a lot of the planning that takes place really takes place early on if we have the information fast enough. Then it really is up to the individuals to make a series of choices over time as people move through what is a progressive disease with no cure and no real treatments at this point that dramatically slow the progression of the disease. And that those range from, should I stay at home or should I go into some sort of facility, a nursing home? If I do stay at home, do I need full-time care? Am I eligible for adult daycare? There in New York City, there are wonderful facilities. And so we, at the Alzheimer's Association, provide people with the opportunity to think through those questions and make decisions.
Now, are there drugs that slow down the progress of the disease or are helpful in the treatment in any way?
There are some drugs that slow the progression for some people. And we encourage people to try those because we think that whatever is in the marketplace should be tried. But we could never tell you that they slow the progression down so the disease doesn't move to its very devastating end.
Right. Not long ago, caregivers, probably most caregivers, were advised to place a loved one in a nursing home. But now there are options. I know that one of the, for keeping them at home, I know that one of the goals of the association is to improve the nursing home care for Alzheimer's patients. Tell me about that.
That's very important to us. I mean, when somebody goes into a home with dementia, they are truly dependent on their professional caregivers in the home. And often the folks who are taking care of these individuals are themselves not trained in what are the behaviors associated with dementia. If somebody strikes out or is angry, it's the disease that's talking, not the individual. So what we've been doing is working with the nursing homes in New York City to have adequate training to help the folks who are doing the care, the certified nursing assistants, the nurses themselves, to really understand what's the best way to care for these people. What are the significant symptoms of Alzheimer's disease and dementia, and how does that affect how I treat somebody? Very, very important.
I could imagine these patients would be very taxing on any caregivers, but certainly on untrained caregivers. You probably run the risk of abuse,
Absolutely.
as a result.
It's hard on family members, but family members have an obvious investment. If I decide to keep my dad at home, then and my father acts out, I know he's not acting out at me. He's ill.
Right.
But in a home where you're dealing with maybe 10 or 20 or 30 people who have these kinds of very dramatic symptoms, it's hard on the people who are doing the care.
Right.
So our job is to train them.
We're going to take a short break. Lou-Ellen Barkan and I will return after the following message.
Any questions?
No.
You know.
We're not magicians, we can't read your mind.
We need your questions, each and every kind. Will this react with my other medicine?
Hey, what are all these tests even for? Questions are the answer.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Lou-Ellen Barkan, CEO and President of the Alzheimer's Association. Your father was lucky enough, or your family was lucky enough to be able to keep your father at home. And I think so many people would like to be able to avoid putting their parents in nursing homes if they could get some kind of support, high quality at home care for them. But that seems to be elusive for a lot of people since that kind of help is so expensive. It's probably out of reach for a lot of Americans, like the Savage family in the movie.
It's exactly right. That's one of our greatest fears, is that as this epidemic plays out across the country, that we're going to lose people in the workforce because they have to stay home and take care of a family member. There really are not enough adequately trained individuals, and there's not enough support to keep people able to pay those individuals, even if they were available. So it becomes extremely difficult. Just at the point in time that someone needs to work in order to pay into the system to provide the kind of resources that would help us all, they have to leave the workforce and stay home, and often go on public assistance themselves. Very difficult scenario.
And I know, people are sort of hawking the long-term care insurance for yourself, towards the end, but I mean, it's really pretty expensive, and to try to pay that and everything else, for maybe 30 years so that you can use it for 3, maybe, it's a burden.
It may be the answer. I'm
really?
Not, yes. I think if we can encourage young people who are much more sensitive today about making sure they have a job, they have medical insurance, where it maybe 25 years ago, young people took a job, and I don't think they really thought much about medical insurance. Today, that's very different. Today, people really, even in their 20s and 30s, if they have a position without insurance, they're concerned about that. we can incent that generation to pay into the system and make sure that by the time they get to this stage, they have adequate care. Assuming we don't have a cure or a treatment at that point, we'd all be better off.
Yeah.
But I don't know that we're going to be able to make that kind of a pitch given where we are today.
Right. And you probably would hope that the price would come down.
You would hope that. You'd hope that more people go into it and the price would come down, but we don't know that yet.
Are there other issues other than insurance? Are there family leave issues, for instance? Is that an issue?
Companies are very reluctant, especially now when they're cutting back and workforce is very tight, to giving people family leave. There is the Family Leave Medical Act, which I'm sure you're aware of, and that allows people under the law to have a certain number of days that they take off, but mostly it's without pay. So they get to keep their medical insurance, but they don't get to keep their salary, and that's a big issue. There's no question over time that companies have to become much more liberal and a little bit more intelligent about allowing people the kind of time they're going to need, because they're going to take it anyway.
Right.
If my dad is out wandering and I'm looking for him, I'm actually going to have to go out and find him. And
Right.
It doesn't so much matter what's going on at my desk.
Now, we talked about the training of healthcare providers, whether they're family members or professional healthcare providers, or paid health care providers. Is this an area, the training of them, is that something that the Alzheimer's Association is involved in?
We are deeply involved with that. We're involved with training medical professions, RNs, CNAs, certified nursing assistants, home care workers, emergency room physicians, and paraprofessionals to make sure that when someone comes into the emergency room, if they have a sign of dementia, they're noticed. All of these folks have to be trained and have to really understand what's going on.
What's the status of funding, whether it's government, foundation funding, pharmaceutical funding, for research for a cure or into the causes of Alzheimer's?
A lot of the funding comes out of the National Institute of Health, as you probably know, and unfortunately that's under a lot of stress. It's under a lot of stress because there's tension and competition for resources these days. So we pitch very hard in our public policy office to get to Washington to help people understand that you're going to pay now or you're going to pay later. If we don't find a cure, if we don't find some sort of adequate treatment, we can continue to pretend like it's not going to matter, but very, very shortly, within less than probably 30 years, we're going to see a tremendous number of people ill with this disease, and we're going to have to deal with it.
You talked about daycare programs for Alzheimer's patients, and that New York has a good program with that. Tell me about that and how that works.
Many of the community centers, many of the nursing homes these days, many of the assisted living have an adult daycare for people with dementia, which is really exactly as it is. It sounds like what it is. People are picked up often in some sort of van or transportation, brought to the center. They're kept busy doing things that are appropriate for the level that they are operating at, and then they are returned home. And that actually frees up the individual who is working to go to work, do their job, and then come back. It doesn't mean that at night they don't have responsibilities or in the morning, but it does give them some opportunity during the day to continue their life.
What are some of the other programs or services that the association is involved in?
Well, we have a wonderful safe return program, and I alluded to it a few minutes ago. People with Alzheimer's disease will wander, and I never say what the percent is because I don't think that's useful. We never know who's going to wander. And so as a consequence of that, they are out on the street very often alone, and they are not easily identified. And just recently in New York, we had a story where somebody did not have a safe return bracelet. Mm-hmm. It's our very simple low-tech program. We partner with Medical Alert, where people have a bracelet, and if something happens or they leave, they wander around, they're lost, we work with the New York City Police Department. And when they are found, let's assume somebody's lying on the ground. You might assume in New York that somebody had substance abuse or was drinking or even was ill and you don't want to deal with them. But if you see a bracelet, what it tells you is that somebody cares for this person, and you're much more likely to stop. And we have a lot of good Samaritans in New York. We have a lot of good stories where people stop and they call the police department. Somebody comes and finds mom and dad, takes them to the proper hospital, and because of the information on our bracelet, they can immediately identify the proper meds, the person's physician, contact the family, and we save lives every day with this program. Mm-hmm. Particularly in the winter when it's so cold, which is what happened last week, people leave the house often without adequate clothing. They're found often alone, and often they're found deceased unless they are protected, and this bracelet does that. Our Safe Return program is an invaluable resource.
Now, do you also have support groups for caregivers?
Yes, we have 140 support groups throughout the city, and often they are specific to particular individuals or groups of people. So we have support groups for spouses, we have support groups for grandchildren, support groups for adult children who are long-distance caregivers, where the mom and dad might live farther away. So we have support groups in Spanish, and we are actually working on increasing the number of diversity programs and outreach programs that we have, which is a big issue for us. We're about to start a big Chinese outreach program to move into the Asian community and work closely with that community to translate our materials in a way that people understand.
Now, you're also involved in some studies at Columbia and NYU Cornell. Tell me about those.
I am, actually. When my dad was sick, I realized that this could be a problem for all of us, and probably just given the statistics, somebody in my family is going to get sick. But I decided I would register for a clinical study, and I did so. And it was a very interesting and scary experience, actually, but worth it. I had very simple physical tests, a blood test, and took my blood pressure, and they weighed me and all the standard stuff. And then I had a long day of cognitive testing. I had to look at puzzles. I had to read numbers backwards and forwards. I had to tell more than just what day it is and who's the president. And at the end of the day, I was tired. But that study now provides all physicians that work with me in the future with a baseline set of information about how I was operating on the day that I was examined. And over time, I'll be examined more regularly. These clinical studies are essential if we are going to get to the root of what the problem is here. And I encourage everyone, whether they have the disease in the family, anyone who's been diagnosed, to try to get into one of these clinical trials. And one way to find out about those is to call us and get it on our newspaper. We have a newsletter, chapter newsletter, mailing list, and all the local studies are in there. And if there's one that's appropriate, that's great. If not, we'll try to find one that's not maybe listed, and we can make sure that someone gets into the right trial.
What do you want to see happen? I know it's a broad question, but in terms of policy, whatever, what would be your priorities? The
priority clearly is cure treatment as quickly as possible. I mean, no question in my mind that given the numbers, that the only thing that's really going to save us over the longer term is to have the proper medication. And it would be wonderful to have something like the polio vaccine, where you are vaccinated early in life or earlier in life, and then, in fact, don't get sick. That's the ideal. The second absolute priority is to ensure that since that is unlikely to happen anytime soon, to make sure we have resources for caregivers and resources for people with the disease. And they include more beds in the nursing homes, better trained staff for both the home care and care in the homes. All the proper resources for caregivers to understand how to take care of people at home with family members. We need people to join support groups and learn more about this. Those are our priorities.
Excuse me. Again, on the issue of better training for the nursing home employees, who tend to be pretty low paid, and that is, and so there's a concern about the quality of the care that they're giving, not just to Alzheimer's patients, but to all patients. What more along those lines, is there more, what can be done?
I like to think of the care that's given to people as being delivered often by people for whom this is the first professional job they've ever had. And I call it workforce development, because what happens is people come, very often they're new immigrants, they come to this country, they take what I think is the hardest job, which is taking care of a dementia patient.
Right.
Very underpaid. They do it with dedication and care. After all, this is my dad and your mom, that's who they're taking care of, right? People we really care deeply about. And we want the care to be extremely good, and they are way underpaid, we think, for the job that they do. We would like to see better pay. The problem is that the homes themselves are struggling with resources in general, trying to give good care to everybody.
Right.
It's a very difficult story, and I'm not sure where the answer comes from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sorry, but we're out of time. But I want to thank Lou-Ellen Barkan for joining me. For the City University of New York and 1-to-1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.